Hey guys, it's Dave. It has been a long time since we sat down together and just did a repot session. Won't be a cozy one because I'm not 100% positive what makes those cozy. They look the same to me. So let me know in the comments, and then maybe this winter we'll do a cozy one. I do want to talk about some questions that I get asked all the time in my comments and in direct messages, things I read online and so forth. Some general observations and maybe some hypothetical questions from you, since I didn't actually reach out in the community tab to ask you for any. Stick with me. Returning viewers will recognize this. I'll be working with my normal substrate, which is Cocoa Coir, Cocoa Chips, and number 3 Perlite. If you want to know the brands I use, those are of course linked in my description. I'm kind of picky about what I use now. I am dialed in. I really like it. That's 1/3 each. When I am potting it up, this is one of the questions I'm asked all the time. It depends, on the size of the plant, the size of the pot, how quickly I think I want it to dry out. Like maybe a globulosa, I might want to dry out more quickly. I'm going to pot up a couple of aeroids that I don't want to dry out that quickly anymore. They are right now, and it's a little too close for comfort on not watering. So in other words, I'm having trouble keeping up with those. But I think this is going to be fun. I'm going to start with Hoya, but as I indicated, it won't just be Hoya today because it fits one question that gets asked online all of the time. And so I have 3 perfect examples of it. And I worked my friend's final plant sale of the year, and per usual, I got paid in plants. Do you know how many plants I've been given for free this year? God, it's astonishing. Well, let's start with this one. I got 3. I don't know which one to start with. This is from Gerard Paul Shirley. So anytime you see a GPS on the accession number, that's from Paul Shirley. He is a grower in the Netherlands. He has even stronger opinions on things than I do, which, ooh. So first question up today is how long to wait before you repot a plant. If you've seen a few of these episodes where I talk about it, just skip forward. I don't wait. I never, ever wait. This is probably going to be the longest I've waited. I got these last Thursday. So why don't I wait? Well, for one, it has never made a difference. I have never rehomed a plant, whether by mail or picked up in person, where I repotted it and it just up and died on me. It just has not happened. So that worry, for me anyway, is off the chalkboard. That was erased years ago, so that's not an issue. What I have done in my life is brought home a plant, not repotted it, and I introduced root mealies, and I have also lost plants very quickly to root rot because the substrate that my friend is using in her greenhouse, which gets a ton of light and a ton of airflow, is not the right mix for me. I'm going to put this in a mix that I understand, that I know how to grow. And sorry, I'm fondling my microphone for some reason. I thought they were headphones. And that way it will dry out in a predictable way for me. So today I'm filming on Tuesday. I got these last Thursday. These are still wet. For me, in a container this small, and I guess this is, in someone's world, a vessel to put alcohol in, which seems awfully small for that, but my channel's not called Sober Plant Guy for no reason. So that's a long time for me, and I would worry about root rot. This is 100% right for her. It's not right for me. So I'm going to open it up and see what we have. Now, I have, I don't know, a couple hundred plants from her at this point. I'm not expecting anything unusual in here like root mealies or anything. So I kind of gently let the substrate fall away, and I begin to evaluate the plant. So this has really nice roots. Now sometimes I buy plants from her that have just been rerouted. I'll show you an example of that. It's in a clear vessel. I could see what's going on. That one I left alone. And it's probably one of the coolest additions of, well, at least I've gotten from her this summer. So I'm not gonna go crazy, you know, I don't need to get every little bit off, but that's good. Now I'm gonna choose a container size. It's either gonna be, these I think are 2.76, so a little under 3, or I was at the Dollar Tree and found these and put some holes in it. I don't want to go too small, and I'm gonna go with the larger one. So, you know, I'm not someone who worries about potting larger established plants. That's another topic in this video I'm going to talk about. But when they're this small and dainty, you know, I'm not going to throw this in a 6-inch pot, you know, and not all pots are created equal. You know, there are 4-inch pots, they're very shallow and they're kind of narrow, and then there are 4-inch pots, they're very deep, so they hold a ton of substrate. So just kind of have to play it by ear. I'm holding it by a dead piece of stem, by the way. So what I have been forgetting to mention to people is that I usually try to get almost kind of pure chunks at the bottom of it, because the cocoa coir is going to sift down. What I don't want to have happen is just to have that be compacted where the roots really, I mean, these are very fine roots, aren't going to find their way through it. So they'll just kind of bunch up. And then you'll see very slow growth. At least I have seen very slow growth when I've done that. Generally try to put it off center so there'll be room for a support when I decide to put that in. And by feel, I'm just going to grab some substrate and throw it on in there. Try not to break that peduncle off. And that's how I do it. And if I've erred on the side of too much chunks in here, I'm happy with that. I have to balance my conditions going into winter. In my house, we keep it probably cooler than a lot of people do. I guarantee you this will be in the tent. No question about that. So that's what it looks like. When I water these, all plants, when I have repotted them like this, I will run water through this until it runs clear, even though I did rinse this cocoa coir and chip. I even buffered it, crazy. And then I'll fertilize it after it's been completely run through. So there's one. This one is Hoyacinus. Very excited about this. This is another plant that you might look at and think, well, that's boring. Well, when you see the flowers of this plant, that's a whole different thing. So there are different reasons to buy different Hoya. This one clearly is going to be for the flower. Let me repot this real quick and I'll be right back with you. This one looks really, really good and healthy too. It has a much smaller root system. So I am going to put it in these clear containers I just bought. Same principle. I'm going to put some chunks in the bottom there. And then I'm going to be a little careful that I'm grabbing chunks and cocoa coir. Sometimes when I'm doing this, I tried to explain this in, I think, the last video, and I mentioned I pick up chunks of cocoa, or pick up cocoa coir and sift it in. I meant to say, after the fact, that I will pick up a whole handful of the mix, and then when I turn my hand to get it in between leaves, then I sift just the cocoa coir in there, and I end up with an unbalanced mix. And I personally generally prefer to err on the side of a little too chunky. I am not an underwaterer, so keep that in mind. That's what works for me. I find mixes that are dense, like the one my friend uses, and she waters her plants, by the way, every day. in the summer. So she would be insane to use a mix like this. She'd be out there 2 or 3 times a day, literally. I was there last week finding plants that looked like they hadn't been watered in days, and it had been a day. So yeah, to thine own self be true, right? Hoyacinni. Woo-hoo-hoo. Very excited. If you are new to the channel, welcome. Thank you for being here. I like to buy my plants small. It is my preference to buy them like this. This is not something I bought this small because I had to, although for this one I had to. But in general, this would be my preference. So I don't buy big baskets of Hoya. For one, the Hoya I'm most interested in now aren't sold in big baskets anyway, so it's a non-starter. And this is the Mutia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I had never heard of it, and my friend popped this out for me, and I really like the curvature of these leaves. It's like an elongated Ricardo almost, that shape. Really cool. And you can imagine this growing on a tree and having the water cascade down, getting the next roots. So anyway, it's a cool plant. I'm sure I'm including the flowers on all of these as we go along. And substrate is breaking away quite. This one's actually much drier than the other two were. Kind of formed to the bottom of the little cup. So let's put this one. Also, I think, you know, it's got a nice crown on it, but not much of a root system. I think it's probably, you know, it might be another good candidate for this clear one here. I don't know what the dimensions of it are. Smallish? Deeper than those little shot glassy type cups, anyway. I find it so quaint that there are people in this world that measure out alcohol. I'm not sure what the point of that is. I'm kidding. I kid with you normal people, you normal drinker people. You know, when I make a mess on top, I don't worry about that at all. I don't try to clean it off, because when I water this through, then I will spray off the leaves, make it look better. You know, try to essentially put the new substrate line up to the stem where it was before. It is certainly not that big a deal if you don't get it just right. I mean, my God, to read the comments online, you'd think the plant has no chance in hell not to rot. Just everybody simmer down a little bit. Plants are very, very durable. All right, we have our Mutia. One of the favorite things I read in the comments is that someone will watch one of my videos and say, thank you, you gave me the courage to try whatever it is. That is my point in all of these, is to experiment a little bit. I never would have known in a million years that I could just go ahead and repot plants and save myself some heartache if I just did it right away. But, you know, to read online, some people just act like their first pot should be their forever pot, you know, kind of thing. Or that upsizing a pot should be done, you know, as a critical last resort. That is another question we'll address with Hoya specifically. For this beautiful plant, this is my wife's beautiful Scindapsus exotica. I showed this in a video not too long ago. Remember which one it is. And it's definitely swirling around in there. This mix is very, very dry. I just watered it on Sunday. So definitely needs a repot. I mean, it's, well, it's mostly roots. All of the soil is falling away from this one. And, you know, I'm not afraid to handle roots, especially like these really super robust ones. So I'm going to do that. question is, so, you know, the conventional wisdom is, you know, to go an inch above, an inch or two, you know, larger than the root ball. That, I ignore that 100% on a mature plant. I don't want to have to repot this in the spring. And roots grow throughout the winter. I did an experiment a couple of years ago because I was one of those people that was just going along with everybody else. Don't fertilize your plants over the winter. They're not really growing, or at least the ones that don't appear to be growing. That is judging only what is happening above the pot. That is not accounting for what's happening below. So I separated out two groups of plants, fertilized half and didn't fertilize half. No exception, there was root growth in the ones that were fertilized that far surpassed the ones that weren't. And then when spring came, the growth above the pot was dramatically better. So there's my 2 cents, and that's probably about what it's worth on that topic. So I'm going to go to quite a much larger pot for this, and chances that I'll pay any penalty for this are almost zero. I mean, you can never say zero, but I'll be growing it in terracotta again. I'll be using a pretty loose substrate, not quite as loose as I do for the Hoya, and it will draw out enough moisture and keep enough moisture that this plant is very likely going to be happy. It's my wife's plant. I wouldn't be doing this unless I was very, very confident that this is going to work well. I love doing this about as much as anything in plants. I really do. It's very relaxing, even when I'm talking to you. So there we go. Easy peasy, beautiful plant. I will get that watered in a little bit here. I put it way up front because this is in one of those little corner shelves, you know, that's got like a half round or whatever percentage of round it is, in front of or beside an east window. And this plant took me forever to get to grow well. And so when she asked me to set up a little plant shelf for her in a room with just the east window, and we have a huge tulip poplar in the summer, it doesn't get a lot of light. This plant started flourishing and has been for a long time now. So it's happy in that spot. It's just drying out every other day, like completely. So time for a nice up pot, and it'll be, you know, a couple of more years before I need to address trimming the root ball or repotting it. We'll see. I'm going to want to, probably I want to keep it about the same size. So anyway, this next one's an epiprimnum. This is the Manjula. This is one that was sold at a big box store. And I have one from Plant Haven, Toronto in the other room. They look quite different. These are very minty green, no matter how bright the light is. And the other one, no matter how dim the light is, maintains a much whiter look. So this one is just going to be a hanging plant again, and is, well, I wonder why it was getting thirsty so quickly. There we go. So another thing that I don't get asked about, but I see online a lot, both on YouTube and in the chat groups, let me tease these out, is the importance of having a microbially active substrate. And, you know, there are people that drive themselves crazy. They will not use a pesticide, a systemic, to treat a horrible pest infestation because they want to have a microbially active substrate. That is insanity. Are you kidding me? You think it's good for the plant to be fighting off spider mites, thrips, and mealybugs all at the same time? No, it is not. It is not good for the plant. But I grow in completely inert substance. So cocoa coir, you know, some people grow in peat still, which you can get an active substrate. But, You know, I grow in completely inert substances, and a lot of people grow in pon or leca. Those are completely inert. So, you know, a lot of you have seen at least, I don't know, 150 of my plants or something. None of those have an active substrate. None. Zero. They get fed through good food, which is GT foliage focus and the MSU formula that I feed all my Hoya with. So I get where they're coming from. I'm from Iowa, and it's a farming community for sure. Out there, yeah, they spend a lot of time worrying about that kind of thing. In container gardening, it's a little bit different. This is a great example of a pot that I was talking about earlier, that it's not nearly as long as a normal flower pot style, so much less depth on it. Get that loaded up real quick here. I did put it in a normal kind of 6-inch size pot, and it looked like it was going to hold a lot of substrate. This, with a little bit along the bottom, is going to be just right. A lot of people would think this is too large, but again, I don't want to think about what is suitable right this very moment. There has to be some compromise between what would be perfect today and what will still be viable and really nice for this plant in a few months. So to me, it makes no sense to go up pot sizes that you can barely get the roots in. I see people do it all the time, and I just think, I mean, what have you accomplished if you do that? To me, not very much. But, you know, maybe some people like repotting over and over and over again. To me, that's more stressful to the plant than bringing one home while it's acclimating and throwing it in a new pot. I mean, that's me though. That's my experience. All right, let's get back in my lane. This is a Hoya. It's species UT039, also known as Flores Island. I recently featured this in some ugly duckling seedlings that I cut up that are propagating right now. I put it in 4 common Hoya problems because it had really good examples of edema. This is in a substrate that dries out almost immediately, and as the roots get dry, it will suck up way more water than the leaves can transpire naturally. The cells will fill, they'll burst. That's permanent. It's absolutely harmless. When you read people say I would cut that leaf off, don't cut the leaf off unless you don't like looking at it, but it's absolutely harmless, but permanent. Now, in that video, I said, and if I had known how many people were going to watch that video, I would have made a better video. I still have an opportunity to, like right now. I said the plant tends to grow out of it, and I should have been more explicit that this was a seedling grown plant. And when the leaves are very young, pushing that right into the light, they tend to do that. But as it puts on more and more foliage, you see that the leaves become very beautiful. And it's more difficult to get edema, in my experience, as the plant grows to maturity. I really like this plant a lot, but it is thirsty. I could water it every day. I went through a spell last spring, I think, where I was making just this incredibly chunky mix. I had got a giant bag of leca cheap, and I was adding it in because I was so disappointed in the cocoa chips I was buying. Not the ones I currently use. I love those. And just, my goodness, I was really going too far to that side. I mean, this is essentially the mix. Well, that's not good. Water is not the enemy. But listen, you know, I have long COVID. It's hard for me to think through things, so I'm going to blame that. I'm going to go with a larger pot. And going to make sure that I get a lot of chunks in the bottom because it is substantially larger. There we go. Another question I get asked a lot is, how often do I water my Hoya? Do I let them go all the way dry? And variations on that theme. And the answer is, what I do is probably not relevant to what will work for you. As unsatisfying as that answer is, I don't view, as I said, water as the enemy. So I water my plants very regularly, and I feed with every watering all year round. The only time I don't put in feed is if I'm really truly doing a flush, like if I'm washing the leaves down with my do-it-yourself spray, and it's just dripping all through the substrate. I might just completely rinse it that one time. I don't do it often. I just had a friend from South Carolina email me, and I'd sent him a couple plants he couldn't find much information about. And my response was, because they didn't particularly need special care, I just said, whatever you're doing to make your other Hoya happy, do that with these. That might vary quite differently between the two of us. So my watering habits may not suit yours at all. You might drown all your plants in plastic pots, I don't know. So it's just something that you have to play around with and get comfortable with. What I do know is that people who do not water their plants get the leaves so they're so soft, they do the taco test, which is a plant in distress in my mind, and then talk about how slow Hoya grow, aren't getting the correlation. Water's not the enemy. If you have a substrate that's appropriate to your plant and the pot and your conditions, it's hard to overwater a plant. Wet roots aren't just going to automatically rot away. Suffocating roots will quickly rot away. So, that's not specific advice, and it shouldn't be specific advice. And when people give very specific advice to you without any context, that's worthless advice in my book. You can draw generalities between large swaths of Hoya, in terms of climate. If you have one from China that grows way up in the mountains, you can draw conclusions that it doesn't need a ton of humidity. It'll probably be happy in cooler rooms. That most Hoya do like to go mostly dry, etc. and so forth. But for someone to tell you how to do it, that's inane. And so anytime, if the words always or never show up in someone's advice, I just write them off. I just do. Because it's never always or never. It's never always or never. Except when I say it. I think with my Hoya vitellina, which is formerly known as Fusco marginata, I'm going to be able to tackle a couple of questions with this one plant. But I want to talk about watering for just one more second, because it's such a common question and concern, and it's the first thing I want to know about any plant, besides I guess temperature and humidity for me. If it's a real heat loving plant, I need to know that, because I can only fit so many in my tent. But the most common thing to be said about Hoya is they're epiphytic, therefore what? Because I'm growing them in my house in Iowa City, Iowa, in a container. There is nothing about that even approximates where these plants originally came from. If you doubt me, have yours grow epiphytically up the tree you have in your living room. Don't water it and then tell me how it goes. Obviously, that is an absurd example, but there are general conclusions we can draw from a plant that grows epiphytically. Once we do this to it, however, we've changed the rules. And it's just that these plants are that adaptable that we have success with them. Some are very challenging to grow in my house. Some I would not even bother trying to grow. And I'm not talking about just Hoya, anthurium that need really high humidity. No, it's not going to grow here. It is not going to work. As much humidity as I try to add over the furnace heated winter, never going to happen. Never going to work. So, you know, a recent example is I try whenever I get a plant that has been started in sphagnum moss, I try to get as much sphagnum moss off as possible. And somebody commented that they don't. And if they have success with that, that's fantastic. That's what this is all about. What works for you? What works for me is that's irrelevant. What works for you is also irrelevant to me if I try it and it doesn't work. I've experienced a ton of root rot over time when I've left moss in, because moss will break down and compress and compress and compress. It will not dry out properly in the substrate. I know years ago, Harley G used to just put a plug of sphagnum moss in. If that worked for her, kudos. She found something that works for her. I would have dead plants. I know this for a fact. I have tried it, so that won't work for me. But the person who wrote that in said they grow epiphytically, and she, you know, assumed in moss and therefore didn't see the problem. Well, one, certainly the roots aren't encased in sphagnum moss. One, that's farmed from bogs, so you're 100% guaranteed it's not growing in the tree. If you're talking about just normal moss, that's already on the tree, and the roots will cascade in and through and around in nooks and crannies and so forth. There's also an enormous root system on a plant that's growing epiphytically. It's going all the way up the trunk, and it's putting its roots out at every chance it can. And on a Hoya, it can root all along the stem. It's not just the node. So we're talking about like potentially like many square feet of roots going up that trunk. Now, we put it in this, we've changed the game. So I like the way I grow it. This is basalt, and this is what I will be putting all of my plants that are in their kind of permanent home in once they get to 6-8 inches, etc. Potting plants is kind of a hot topic. A lot of people just are afraid to do it, and I guess I've already touched on it, but just to carry that thought forward, the best grower probably in the United States in terms of how many plants Hoya he has succeeded in blooming where no one else has in a home cultivated environment is Doug Chamberlain of Vermont Hoyas. He uppots his Hoyas all the time. Now, I'm not talking crazy like taking that little tiny root system of those first 3 plants and throwing it in a 6-inch pot, but it's very common for him to uppot 2 or 3 times in a year, or over the course of the plant's life. Like I was just reading about a Vitellina, and it was in an 8-inch pot, like one of the big style, and it was ready for a 10-inch pot. And the actual plant was not huge, so you know it's whatever you find that works for you. I find uppotting Hoya to be no problem at all. I do think that the reason people suggest that is because having too small a pot stresses the plant and produces flowers. I have no problem producing flowers in healthy, mature plants in pots that I don't have to water every other day. So that is something that gets passed around all the time. Hoya love to be root bound. No, they most certainly do not love to be root bound. No plant loves to be root bound. That's a specific term that gets thrown around for everything. They don't need huge amounts of substrate around the root ball. That's true, but that's not root bound. Root bound is like those aeroids you saw, where it's struggling to get its basic needs like water and food. So, and that's not good for the plant. But at any rate, my 2 cents again. But if you look at really successful Hoya growers at any stage of their development, you will find people who are feeding their plants and putting them in larger pots. And that's anyone from me, Kevin up in Canada, Miro, Doug, Minnie, my friend in Cedar Rapids, Crazy Plant Gal, who's got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Hoya growing under her care. We find these pieces of advice, you know, I find them more damaging because I follow it more closely, and she just giggles, you know, kind of like, whatever, you know. But at any rate, there's off the soapbox, Dave. So back to Vitellina, believe it or not. One thing I hear quite often I haven't been asked this specifically, but I read it a lot, is not to cut more than 1/3 of the plant because you'll put it into shock and it won't grow. I'm not even sure where that came from. It might be true. I don't know. I've heard it more commonly with the roots, not to take more than 1/3 of the roots off, which makes more sense to me. I quite commonly take more than 1/3 of my Hoya and grow the plant just fine. This one is going to get cut. I guess I can just take this out because I'm going to start a bunch of these. So I'll have some of these next year for people and me. So there is one strand. I find this plant more beautiful grown in lower light, like I have started doing. It can sun stress and it can get pretty red, but it's kind of like when I get a sunburn versus suntan. It's not a pretty sun stress by any stretch, I don't think. I find it much prettier to have like this leaf here. Very reminiscent of the KSB01 I am so very fond of. So I am going to chop these up real quick and then get back to this plant. One reason I don't mind chopping this plant up is that I really am here for the leaves, the foliage of this plant. The flowers are okay. I don't think they're anything special. It's a very fast, aggressive grower, and it's one that's in demand. I had so many requests for this year, and I was just growing it out, and I succeeded in doing that. And now I'm going to start it over. I'm going to start it over with some really nice cuts for me. I will obviously pick the best, one or two, and but I'm going to look at this root system and decide what I'm going to do with this. And this might be, you know, what I start with. But if it can be downsized in a pot, you know, I don't know what's going on here. I haven't seen it in a long time. I'm curious. I think it could go in a smaller pot based on how the watering's been going. And I would say I was correct in that I probably dry rotted this plant at some point. Let's take a look. You won't be able to see anything yet. Strong roots in here. That's massive, thick root. So pretty good overall. I will chuck all of this. I could sterilize it. I won't sterilize it. I think I'll grow it in something more like this. Just found this thrift shopping this weekend. It had written on it in chalk, "Don't give up, love hard." I do not know what that means. I like to think I love just about right, just kind of medium hard. But where are we going with this? Nowhere good. Nowhere good. I stepped into the kitchen and added a little bit more cocoa chunk. What happens when I mix it up like this, I tend to grab more chunks, and then as it gets down to like the last, I don't know, third of the bowl, I end up with just a lot of cocoa coir. So I often have to redo it, which is an indication that I don't usually end up with the mix that's 1/3 of each ingredient by the time it gets into the container. I'm very gentle with my plants. And that root ball is sticking up too high. So, do over. Psych. There we go. This is a plant that does like it warm. It would prefer it if it never got down below probably 70. I can do an average temperature maybe of 70, but overnight it gets down into the 60s in the tent, which is where this has been growing over the winters. I generally take it out over the summer, and this year I didn't. I left it in there just to accelerate the growth. Haven't done that tent video yet. Oh my goodness. I won't even promise when I'm going to try to do it. I have designs on getting it done this week, but how's that gone so far? I think that will be just fine. It's quite loose in there right now because it's not watered in, but I may just do a stake on this, maybe a hoop. It looked okay on this type trellis, but I didn't love it. I don't know what I'll do. I have time to think about it. We'll get it watered in and see what we think about that. Now, let me clean up. I'll be right back. Okay, yes, I was going to try to repot the Brazil next to me by myself. I think I will wait for my wife. This video feels like it got a little bit long anyway. One thing I kind of wanted to touch on is advice I see quite often, which is probably good advice, maybe. And that's that beginners should start with beginner plants. Unless, let me be a contrarian, which is just my natural state. I truly was, in elementary school, I was that kid who wanted to know who says and why. And it got so bad that they wanted to bump me up a grade because they thought I was bored. And I wasn't bored. I genuinely want to know who says and why. So advice that gets tossed around all the time, advice that I know is being given by people who have been in the hobby for months, can't possibly know that. They cannot know it. They've read it and they're repeating it. And that is not valuable advice. I digress. Beginner plants and beginners. If a person has no interest in the hobby itself and just wants some easy plants to decorate the house with, for sure. Beginner plants, 100%. But what if somebody wants to be a hobbyist and finds, I don't know, an intervariegated or outer variegated carnosa boring? I thought those were old auntie plants. I was not attracted to them at all. It put me off of Hoya. It is the rarer plants that interested me. If you go into the hobby with the understanding that I'm going to make mistakes and I have a tolerance for that, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, let's face it. The hobby is learning how to water the plant. I saw Summer Rain Oaks in a video say you haven't grown a plant until you've grown it 3 times. And it sounds like kind of cynical, like you have to kill it a couple times before you know what you're doing. But I mean, I thought about it a little bit and she has a point. If you get a syngonium, I'll just grab that out of the thin air, put it in a window, it gets good light, and you water it appropriately and it grows. Have you learned how to grow a syngonium? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. You've certainly found a spot that one syngonium will grow in. So if you get a globulosa, for instance, you will learn about overwatering it if you're not careful. It will teach you more than getting a carnosa that will sit dry in its pot for 3 weeks beyond, any point where a normal Hoya might have dry rotted and died, So I think that's up to the individual. My tolerance for experimentation and failing, and I don't consider any opportunity to learn a failure, is very, very high. But I speak with confidence from my experience. So that's valuable, at least to me. When I get a new plant, I don't scour the ends of the earth and look for care tips on it. I research the plant. Where is it from? What temperatures does it grow in? What were its humidity conditions? So that gives me a good starting base, and I start like I would start most other plants when I get something I'm not too sure of. Maybe I'm a little conservative on the water. I let the plant talk to me. And I've learned enough about plants to watch for signs and catch things early. Usually, I'm going to have plants die. That's just how it's going to go. So, not a big deal. I guess I will save my hypothetical questions for next time since I have really filled up quite a bit of time today. I enjoyed spending it with you. I will see you in the next one, whether it's the tent video or not, who knows, real soon. Bye-bye.